October of the year 732 was a time shrouded in icy gloom and relentless dampness. The setting was a bleak and damp valley, somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers, nestled deep within the core of the Frankish kingdom. The landscape was cloaked in a grey, moist fog that clung stubbornly to withered grass and bare branches of trees, creating an almost ghostly veil over the land. In this murky haze, the faint outlines of two armies, two worlds, seemed to be frozen in a moment of deadly anticipation. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible sense of foreboding, heavy like a damp, woolen cloak soaked in rain. The air itself seemed alive with expectation, silent and oppressive, whispering of an impending clash whose outcome could reshape the destiny of an entire continent. Yet, at this moment, no one knew what the future truly held. Neither the battered warriors in heavy armor, forming an impassive square atop a northern hill, nor the lightly clad horsemen with their Arab steeds, impatiently pounding the muddy earth to the south, were fully aware of the profound importance unfolding before their eyes. They stood poised on the brink of history, unaware that on this very day, in this seemingly insignificant field, the threads of fate would intertwine into a knot that would determine the future of the entire continent for generations to come. To the north, a formidable wall of human defense had taken shape, a barrier forged from shields, spears, and unyielding human will. It was a steadfast, immovable wall, reminiscent of a glacier descending from the icy heights of the Alps. These were the Franks, a Germanic people hardened through decades of endless warfare. Their leader was a man whose name had become a byword for brutality and indomitable resolve, a bastard born in defiance of convention, who had seized power through bloodshed and iron will. His grip on leadership was as unbreakable as steel, and he embodied the ruthless determination to defend what was his. Opposite them, on the southern plains, a tempest was gathering, a rushing wave of steel rocking manes, gleaming armor, and flowing banners that fluttered fiercely in the wind, creating a tumult of movement and noise. This was the army of the Umayyad Caliphate, the mightiest empire the world had seen since the days of Rome. From distant lands, their ancestors had once been scattered tribes wandering in the vast Arabian deserts. Now, a mere century later, their realm stretched from the Indian subcontinent all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, an expansive empire built upon conquests and relentless expansion. Their commanding general was a renowned military strategist, a veteran of countless battles, who had come to these distant lands not merely seeking spoils, but driven by ambitions of glory and the desire to bring new provinces under the sway of the caliphate. These two formidable forces faced each other for 7 days, glaring across the hollows of autumn rains and biting winds, as they tested each other's patience and resolve. A tense stalemate had settled over the field, each side awaiting the inevitable moment when the clash would erupt, sealing the fate of many. For the Franks, this battle was nothing less than a struggle for their very existence, to defend their homes, their faith, and the future of their people. Every man fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat could mean annihilation. For the Arab warriors, it was yet another step on their sacred path, a holy war, a divine mission. Their goal was to conquer and bring the rich lands beneath the Prophet's banner, to expand the reach of their faith and empire. This story, known to many as the Battle of Poitiers, and to some as the Battle of Tours, continues to evoke fierce debate among historians to this day. Was it a pivotal event that saved Christian Europe from inevitable conquest? Or was it merely a successful halt, a temporary pause in the relentless wave of raiding and expansion? It is a saga that pits two civilizations, two religions, and two military machines against each other in a contest of ultimate survival and dominance. We will trace the entire journey that brought these armies onto the plains of Wadia. We will uncover the origins of the Islamic Caliphate and its rapid, wildfire-like expansion across the known world. We will delve into the bloodshed and chaos of the Frankish realm, where a dynasty of lazy kings was gradually replaced by fierce, ambitious military leaders eager to shape history. We will become acquainted with the key figures of this momentous narrative, such as Charles Martel, the Hammer, and Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus. This is a story about how, in a single cold October day, the fate of future ages was decided on a seemingly insignificant field. Yet, the roots of this decisive conflict extended back over a century, to the blistering sands of Arabia, in a time when the world was vastly different. To truly grasp the magnitude of the threat that loomed over the Franks in the year 732, we must journey back in time exactly 100 years earlier, to the year 632. Only then can the full scope of the danger become clear, revealing the centuries of destiny that had been leading up to this critical moment. In the year of our Lord, in the city of Medina, nestled in the very heart of the Arabian Peninsula, an extraordinary man drew his last breath, Prophet Muhammad, a figure whose life, death, and legacy would forever alter the course of world history. His departure marked not the end of an empire in the conventional sense, with defined borders, bureaucratic administrations, and standing armies of professional soldiers. Instead, he left behind something vastly more profound and enduring, a new, passionate faith called Islam, along with a united community, or Ummah, composed of Arab tribes that for centuries had been embroiled in fierce rivalries and mutual hostility. This nascent collective, galvanized and driven by their shared belief, possessed an explosive vitality that, in the immediate aftermath of the Prophet's passing, threatened to dissolve into chaos. Many tribes, feeling liberated from their oaths of allegiance, chose to break away, slipping into disunity. However, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, who was also the Prophet's trusted confidant and deputy, took decisive action to prevent the entire community from disintegrating. With firm resolve, he quelled the uprisings known as the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy, and re-established unity among the tribes. More than merely restoring a fragile political order, Abu Bakr harnessed the freed-up military energy of the Arab tribes, directing it outward with a new purpose. Thus began the era of the Great Arab Conquests. The rapidity and scale of what unfolded over the next few decades were unprecedented in human history. It was indeed a military revolution, a swift, sweeping transformation that saw the Arab warriors carve through their adversaries with astonishing speed. The two mighty empires, which for centuries had been bitter rivals, now found themselves exhausted and weakened after their most destructive war, a conflict that lasted almost 30 years. These once formidable powers, the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, and the Sassanid Empire of Persia, resembled two ancient wounded lions struck down from their ages-long conflicts. Their weakened forms became easy prey as a ravenous pack of young, hungry wolves descended upon them from the vast, arid desert. Under the leadership of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Arab armies achieved extraordinary victories. In the year 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, they decisively defeated a massive Byzantine force, dealing a fatal blow to Byzantine control in the Levant. They reclaimed the entire regions of Syria and Palestine, with the city of Jerusalem soon falling into their hands. Almost simultaneously, in the year 637, at the Battle of Qadisiyah, the Persian army was shattered. The once rich Persian capital of Ctesiphon fell, marking the end of the Sassanid dominance, which had endured for centuries. Over a series of swift campaigns, the entire Persian Empire was absorbed into the expanding Islamic Caliphate. Following this, Egypt, the wealthiest province of the Byzantine Empire, became the next target. By the year 642, the city of Alexandria had surrendered, sealing the conquest of yet another vital region. What lay at the core of this extraordinary success? Historians identify several key factors that explain the swift expansion. First was the unwavering zeal of the Arab warriors, whose faith inspired them to fight as if they were defending the very truth, promising paradise to those who fell in battle. Second was their superior military tactics. The light, mobile Arab cavalry, while accustomed to the harsh desert conditions, proved to be an ideal instrument for rapid maneuvers, flanking attacks, and swift strikes against the slow-moving, often multi-ethnic armies of Byzantium and Persia. Thirdly, the weakened state of their opponents played a vital role. Both the Byzantines and Persians had been drained by decades of protracted warfare, leaving their populations, primarily Christian Monophysites and Nestorians in Syria and Egypt, disillusioned and often welcoming the Arab conquerors as liberators rather than invaders. Unlike some empires that enforced their culture and religion through brutal means, the Arabs generally refrained from forcing conversion through violence. Christian and Jewish communities, the so-called people of the book, were allowed to practice their faiths and retain local self-governance, provided they paid a special tax known as the jizya. For many of these communities, this arrangement was more advantageous than the heavy taxation imposed by the Byzantines, making the Arab rulers, in their relative tolerance, appear as less oppressive overlords. Following the death of the fourth righteous Caliph Ali in the year 661, and with the onset of the first civil war within the Islamic community, political power was transferred to the Umayyad dynasty. The capital of the Caliphate was moved from Medina, the city known for its deep religious and cultural history, to Damascus, an ancient hub of commerce and civilization that had long-standing significance in the Mediterranean world. The Umayyads transformed the Caliphate into a true hereditary empire, establishing a centralized rule that was passed down within their family line, cementing their authority for generations to come. In their efforts to consolidate power, the Umayyads adopted many administrative practices from the Byzantine and Persian empires, which had been advanced and sophisticated systems of governance at the time. They developed a powerful navy, enabling them to control vast maritime routes and extend their influence across the Mediterranean basin. Additionally, they introduced their own currency, the dinar, which helped unify the economic fabric of the growing empire and facilitated trade across different regions. The Umayyad Empire was immense and sprawling in its territorial reach. It extended from the eastern borders near China and the Indus River all the way across the continent to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in the west. Under their rule, the Islamic conquests did not slow down but gained even greater momentum. The caliphs turned their eyes westward, focusing on the remaining territories of the Byzantine Empire in North Africa, specifically on what was known as the Carthaginian Exarchate, a significant administrative region with strong historical roots. However, beyond mere ambition, the Arab expansion into this region met fierce resistance. The conquest of the Maghreb, or the western part of North Africa, stretched out over nearly 70 years. The Arab soldiers faced formidable obstacles. Not only did they encounter the remnants of Byzantine garrisons still holding their ground, but they also had to contend with local populations who were fiercely proud and warlike. Among these native groups, the Berber tribes stood out for their resilience and strength. The most legendary figure among them was the warrior Queen Dahia al-Kahina, who managed for several years to unite the Berber tribes in a formidable defensive front against the Arab invaders, temporarily driving them out of the region. Her leadership became a symbol of resistance and a beacon of hope for native independence. Despite these early successes, the tide of resistance could not be held back forever. By the end of the 6th century, the persistent and determined opposition was eventually crushed. In the year 698, the city of Carthage fell, marking a decisive point in the Arab campaign to control North Africa. Following their defeat, many Berbers converted to Islam en masse, drawn by the promise of new opportunities and the unifying force of faith. They joined the Arab armies, bringing to the battlefield their renowned ferocity and resilience, traits that infused the expanding caliphate's military strength. By the year 710, the entire region of North Africa, stretching from Egypt in the east all the way to Morocco in the west, was firmly under the control of the caliphate. Arab and Berber warriors established their presence on the southern shores of the Strait of Gibraltar. Before their eyes, across the narrow strait, lay the land once known as Hispania, the kingdom of the Visigoths, a territory that was soon to become the next target of Islamic expansion and conquest. The Arab forces observed a land cloaked in a faint shimmer of heat and haze, the land that the Romans had once called Spain, and that the Arabs would later refer to as Al-Andalus. This Visigothic kingdom had a long and tumultuous history. It was an era marked by violence, conquest, and fleeting statehood. The Visigoths had once led the sack of Rome itself, an event that became a defining moment in their history. Later, as allies of the Roman Empire, they participated in cleansing the Iberian Peninsula of other barbarian tribes, stabilizing their control, and establishing their own kingdom with the city of Toledo as its capital. By the beginning of the 6th century, the Visigothic kingdom had been ruling in Spain for nearly 3 centuries. Yet beneath this apparent stability, a profound internal weakness simmered. The Visigothic state was essentially a fragile giant, held together by unstable political alliances and constant conflicts over succession. The monarchy was not based on a clear, hereditary system. Instead, kings were often chosen by the nobility, which frequently led to power struggles, conspiracies, and open civil wars whenever a new ruler ascended to the throne. Monarchs rarely died peacefully in their beds, as assassinations and violent overthrow attempts were an accepted part of the political landscape. In addition to political instability, a profound social division persisted within the kingdom. A small aristocratic elite possessed vast estates and wielded tremendous influence, dominating the land and resources. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, largely composed of the Hispano-Roman commoners, lived in a state of semi-serfdom, their lives constrained beneath a feudal-like system. This stark contrast created a society riddled with tension, corruption, and internal discord, weakening the once powerful realm and making it vulnerable to external threats. This complex and fragile political and social fabric would shape the history of the Visigothic kingdom in the centuries that followed, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would ultimately lead to its decline and the subsequent waves of conquest sweeping through the Iberian Peninsula. In the heart of the kingdom, there was a large and influential Jewish community that had lived there for generations. Over the centuries, this community faced relentless persecution by the Visigothic kings, especially after their adoption of Catholicism and the abandonment of Arian beliefs. These monarchs often subjected Jews to brutal repression, forcibly converting many to Christianity and confiscating their property and possessions. Such oppressive policies created deep divisions within the kingdom, fostering resentment and hostility among significant segments of the population who harbored growing hatred toward the ruling regime. Amidst this tense backdrop, a new and tragic dynastic crisis unfolded, marking a turning point in the kingdom's history. In the year 1110, King Witiza died unexpectedly. Despite his wishes for his son to succeed him peacefully, the nobility, seeking to preserve their own influence, chose a different ruler, one of Witiza's more powerful nobles, Duke Roderick. This decision did not sit well with many supporters of Witiza's lineage. A faction known as the Witiza supporters or the Witizian party refused to accept the legitimacy of Roderick's ascension. They seethed with resentment and began plotting ways to overthrow the new king and restore their preferred heir to the throne. Their plans, however, extended beyond the borders of the kingdom, beyond the familiar realm of internal politics. The story that follows is shrouded in legends and tales that blend fact with myth, making it difficult to disentangle historical truths from romanticized lore. A central figure in this narrative is a certain Count Julian, who was the Byzantine governor of Ceuta, a strategic fortress on the African coast representing the last holdout that refused to fall under Arab control. According to a romanticized and later chronicled version of the story, King Roderick, in a moment of cruelty or perhaps betrayal, dishonored Julian's daughter, the beautiful Florinda, who was sent away to be raised at the Talas court. Consumed by fury and driven by a desire for revenge, Julian allegedly called upon the Arab forces, providing ships and resources to facilitate their invasion into Spain. Yet, this version, while captivating, is more legend than factual. A more pragmatic and likely scenario suggests that Count Julian, who was aligned with the Witizian faction, sought an alliance with the Muslim Arabs by offering assistance in their campaign against King Roderick. His aim was not to betray his land outright but to leverage the Arab invasion as a means to weaken Roderick's rule and eventually restore his allies to power. In essence, Julian and his supporters saw this as a calculated move, viewing the Arab forces as potential tools for their internal political ambitions. This strategic misjudgment proved to be disastrous. Many historical instances show that inviting foreign powers to intervene in internal conflicts often leads to uncontrollable consequences, and this was no exception. The Abbasid Caliphate's representative in North Africa, Musa ibn Nusair, initially responded cautiously to Julian's proposal. In the year 1710, he dispatched a small reconnaissance force to assess the situation, which conducted a successful raid along the southern coast, returning laden with plunder and valuable intelligence about unrest within the kingdom. Convinced of the weakness of the Visigothic kingdom, Musa ibn Nusair authorized a full-scale invasion. In the spring of the following year, 1,800 tribesmen, mostly Berbers but led by skilled Arab commanders, most notably the talented General Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The force, numbering approximately between 7,000 and 12,000 warriors, landed at a rocky promontory that has since borne the name of its conqueror, Jabal Tariq, meaning the Mountain of Tariq, which over time evolved into Gibraltar. King Roderick, upon learning of the invasion, quickly assembled his armies and marched southward to confront the invaders. Confident of victory, he believed his forces, likely 2 or 3 times larger than the Arab army, would crush the newcomers. The decisive battle took place in July of the year 1711, near the banks of the river Guadalete. It stretched over several days and was fierce and brutal. The outcome of this pivotal confrontation was sealed by treachery at the worst moment. In the chaos of battle, 2 brothers Appa and Sigisbert, who commanded the flanks of the Visigothic army and secretly belonged to the faction supporting Witiza, abandoned their posts and withdrew from the battlefield. Their betrayal left the center exposed, and the entire Visigothic force faltered. Roderick himself fought till the very end, according to legend, until he drowned in the nearby river as the army panicked and dispersed. The victory of the Arab forces marked the beginning of a new era in the Iberian Peninsula's history, a moment defined as much by strategic misjudgments as by the tragic fall of a once mighty kingdom. His white horse and shoes embroidered with gold were found on the riverbank, yet his body remained missing. The victory at Gualda was complete and overwhelming. The Visigothic kingdom had ceased to exist, its monarchs vanquished utterly, leaving a clear path into the depths of Spain for the conquerors. Meanwhile, Tariq ibn Ziyad, having exceeded his authority, did not wait for directives from Musa ibn Nusair but instead launched an aggressive campaign of conquest. Dividing his forces into multiple detachments, he swept through city after city with nearly no resistance, capturing them one by one. Rather than organizing a proper defense, the Visigothic nobility either fled northward or entered into treaties with the arriving Arab armies, ceding their lands and maintaining their faith in exchange for loyalty. The Jewish community, oppressed under Visigothic rule, often greeted the Arabs warmly and actively supported them in holding key cities under their control. Soon after, Tariq seized the seat of government in Taild. In the year 712, the core Muslim army, led by Musa ibn Nusair himself, arrived in Spain, establishing their presence more firmly across the peninsula. Envious of his subordinates' rapid gains, Musa chose a different route into the heartland, capturing notable cities such as Seville and Merida, the latter offering fierce and prolonged resistance. Within only a few years, nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula, save for some isolated mountainous regions in the north, fell under the sway of the Caliphate's rule. This new territorial division was designated as Al-Andalus, with Córdoba established as its capital, a city destined to become a magnificent hub of culture, learning, and power. The collapse of the Visigothic kingdom unfolded with startling swiftness. Its fall was driven less by the strength of Arab weaponry and more by the internal decay that had long been festering within its own fabric. Betrayal, chaos, and deep-seated social and religious divisions created the ideal conditions for conquest. For the Islamic world, this conquest represented a triumphant expansion, a significant milestone in their history. Conversely, for Christian Europe, it marked a catastrophic defeat. It was the first time that a considerable portion of Western Europe found itself under the dominion of Islam. The line dividing these two worlds was no longer demarcated by the sea but now traced along the mountain ranges of the Pyrenees, beginning a new frontier. Yet, this boundary was only temporary. The eye of the new rulers of Al-Andalus was already turned northward, toward the wealthy yet, as they believed, weakened and fragmented Frankish kingdom. Meanwhile, beyond the mountains, across the lands once part of the Roman Gallic world, lay the largest and most powerful of the barbarian kingdoms that had risen to replace Rome, the kingdom of the Franks. However, describing it as mighty during the early 7th century was a stretch. Like the Visigothic realm, it was suffering through a profound systemic crisis. This was a shadowy kingdom, where genuine power had long slipped from the grasp of those who nominally wore crowns. Officially, the Frankish realm was governed by the Merovingian dynasty, descendants of the legendary Chlodwig, who had united the Frankish tribes and converted to Catholic Christianity. Yet the golden age of the Merovingians was long past. Their later representatives appeared in history with mocking nicknames such as the Lazy Kings or Ruoc-Finian, a term rooted in the Frankish language. These rulers were mere figureheads, lacking true authority, wealth, or influence. They grew long hair, which was considered a symbol of kingship, rode around the country in wagons dragged by oxen, and only once a year convened with the noble council. Their reigns were characterized by a superficial semblance of power, while the real reins of authority belonged to powerful noble families and regional chieftains, often secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. Throughout their entire existence, their primary role was simply to exist and to serve as a kind of sanctified validation for the authority of those truly in power. Their sacred status bestowed upon them a legitimacy that helped reinforce the dominance of ruling figures, even if they themselves wielded no real power. The true power, in reality, belonged to the mayors of the palace, historic figures whose title, in Latin major domus, literally translates as the head of the household. Initially, this position was nothing more than the steward responsible for managing the royal court, overseeing domestic affairs. However, as the authority of the reigning monarchs waned over time, the mayors of the palace gradually assumed control over all the vital levers of state governance, control of the treasury, the military, and the justice system. They effectively became the real rulers of the Frankish realm, ruling as de facto monarchs without the official crown. By this period, the once unified Frankish kingdom had already been divided into several principal regions. The most prominent among them were Neustria, located in the western part of the land with its capital in Paris, and Austrasia in the east, centered around Metz. Within these territories, noble families from different clans continuously vie for dominance, particularly in their competition for control over the office of the mayor of the palace, which was essentially the key position governing the entire kingdom. By the end of the 6th century, a clear favorite emerged, a formidable host of noble houses from Austrasia, collectively known as the Pippinids, or later, by the name of their most famous descendant, the Carolingians. The foundational figure responsible for establishing their power was Pippin of Heristal, a man whose influence grew through strategic military victories and political alliances. It was during the decisive Battle of Tertry that he crushed the army of the Neustrian mayor of the palace, sealing his dominance not only over Austrasia but also bringing the entire Frankish realm under his control. From that point forward, Pippin ruled as an undisputed leader and absolute dictator, holding the titles of Duke and Princeps of the Franks, a Latin phrase meaning Duke and Prince of the Franks, Dux Princeps Francorum. Yet, he kept the Merovingian king on the throne, operating essentially as a puppet ruler while he wielded real power behind the scenes. Pippin understood well that the Frankish kings still lacked the collective strength and readiness to accept a dynastic change. Thus, even at the height of the Pippinid family's growing influence, a new individual was born, someone destined to face the Arab threat that loomed on the horizon. His name was Charles, born out of wedlock to Pippin of Heristal and his noble mistress, Alpais. In a world where noble birth determined a person's social standing and future prospects, the stigma of being considered a bastard was a severe obstacle, not just a social wrinkle, but a real hurdle to attaining power. His life thus began amid constant struggles for survival. When Pippin of Heristal died in the year 714, his lawful wife, Pulcheria, an ambitious and commanding woman, seized the reins of power as regent for her young grandson. She viewed her step-grandson, Charles, only 26 years old, both as a threat and as an obstacle to her own authority. Her decision was drastic. She ordered his arrest and imprisonment, locking him away in a fortress in Cologne. To many, it seemed his fate was sealed, to die forgotten in captivity. Yet, the death of the old ruler sent shockwaves through the kingdom, and chaos soon followed. Peripheral duchies such as Aquitaine, Bavaria, and Thuringia instantly declared their independence from central authority, refusing to acknowledge any subordinate status to the regency. Simultaneously, the Saxons and the Frisians launched fresh and devastating raids into Frankish territories, compounding the kingdom's instability. The aristocracy of Neustria, which had always despised the Austrasian dominance, took matters into their own hands and elected a new mayor of the palace from their own faction. Meanwhile, the fragile state that Pippin had built, painstakingly consolidating power, was rapidly unraveling into fragments. Amidst this turmoil, Charles managed an improbable escape from captivity. Alone, impoverished, and devoid of any armies or resources, he fled into the dense forests of the Ardennes, seeking refuge there. It was in these dark woods that his true character began to emerge. Instead of succumbing to despair, Charles refused to surrender, he persisted. Around him, those dissatisfied with the current chaos started to gather, disillusioned veterans, young warriors hungry for glory and plunder, drawn by the promise of leadership and a chance to shape the future. Charles proved to be a born leader, endowed with physical strength, exceptional endurance, and a ruthless yet strategic mind. His military talents were evident from the very beginning, and in the years that followed, this led to a relentless, ongoing conflict. For several years, he waged war with a vigor and energy that seemed unstoppable, constantly pushing forward, rallying followers, and fighting his way through adversity. His resilience and leadership began to carve a path toward finally uniting the fractured kingdom and facing the external threats that had only grown more dangerous. In the turbulent times of early medieval Europe, he emerged as a formidable and decisive figure, shattering the power of the Neustrians, then crushing the united Neustrian army alongside their newly forged allies. His campaigns were relentless, driven by an unyielding desire to consolidate and expand his dominion. He expelled the plectrum, an influential faction, and seized the treasure of the Austrasian realm, proclaiming himself as the master of his domain, a true ruler of his household. With this newfound authority, he turned his energies to methodically reconstructing and strengthening his kingdom. His military campaigns extended across the land, as he subdued rebellious dukes, repelled Saxon incursions on the borderlands, and subdued the Frisian tribes. Every victory not only expanded his territories but also gained him fresh supporters and increased his standing among the nobility. These conquests became the foundation upon which Karl, later known to history as the Great, forged a new and formidable Frankish army. He realized that to effectively counter the swift cavalry of his enemies and to undertake rapid military campaigns, he needed to create a professional cavalry force of his own. However, maintaining an army of heavily armored horsemen equipped with horses, spears, swords, and armor was an extremely costly affair. The expenses included sourcing vast amounts of land, from which these warriors could draw sustenance. It was then that Karl discovered a solution. He began a large-scale secularization process, systematically confiscating ecclesiastical lands and distributing them to his soldiers as benefices, lands granted for life in exchange for military service. This move enraged the clergy, who later portrayed him in their chronicles as a plunderer and a destroyer of spiritual wealth. Yet, this policy was instrumental in creating a corps of well-armed professional soldiers loyal to him personally and in establishing a disciplined, dedicated military force. By the time the Arab threat appeared on the southern borders of his realm, Karl was no longer simply a master of his household. He had been tempered in battle, ruthless in his methods, and pragmatic in his governance. He stood as the leader of the most powerful military force in all of Christian Europe. Though he had not yet earned his legendary nickname, the hammer had already been forged, its blows soon to be felt across the continent. It seemed as if the world itself was frozen in a delicate equilibrium. To the south, the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus had fortified their hold, transforming Córdoba into a sparkling metropolis of wealth and culture. Meanwhile, to the north, Karl, still uncalled the Hammer, was absorbed in endless campaigns against Germanic tribes and rebellious nobles. Between these two rising powers, two giants on the European stage, lay a crucial buffer zone, the vast and rich Duchy of Aquitaine. Its ruler, Duke Ead the Great, found himself caught in a precarious position between the hammer and the anvil. His story was one of tragic pride, an attempt by a proud leader to preserve his independence in a world where nothing remained untouched by the march of conquest. Aquitaine, stretching across nearly all of southwestern France, was a land apart. It bore the marks of a more romanticized culture than the northern Frankish territories, still clinging to remnants of antiquity. Here, remnants of Roman civilization persisted: vibrant cities, thriving vineyards, and bustling trade routes. Duke Ead, also known as Odo, was a cunning and ambitious politician. He considered himself a sovereign king in his own right, refusing to recognize the authority of either the Frankish mayors of the palace or Karl himself. At the same time, he was acutely aware of the rising threat from the south, those advancing from the Pillars of Hercules. The Muslim governors of Al-Andalus had established a firm grip on the peninsula. From their vantage point, they viewed the rich lands of Gaul as a natural continuation of their expanding territories. For them, these lands were not only targets for conquest in the name of faith but also sources of enormous wealth and resources. As early as the 17th year after the birth of Christ, which corresponds roughly to the early 8th century, these Arab governors began crossing the Pyrenees, invading Septimania, a coastal region of southern France still nominally under Visigothic control. By the year 720, they managed to seize the city of Narbonne, transforming it into their primary military foothold to the north of the Pyrenees, marking the beginning of a new phase in the long history of conquest and expansion in the region. Following these events, they began to launch regular raids, known as razzias, against the region of Aquitania. These frequent attacks grew increasingly bold and organized, eventually evolving from sporadic plundering into large-scale military campaigns. It was in the year 721 that a new governor of Al-Andalus, Alsam ibn Malik al-Halani, decided to deliver a heavy blow to their resilient opponents. He assembled a formidable army, including siege engines and various military machines, and advanced toward the city of Toulouse, the capital of Aquitania. This confrontation marked a significant shift. What had once been minor raids had now turned into an all-out attempt at conquest. The city was besieged, encircled by enemy forces. For Duke Eudes, the leader of the region, the situation had become desperate. His forces were too small and ill-equipped to withstand a direct battle with Alsama's army in open terrain. Recognizing the peril, Eudes made the difficult decision to leave a garrison in Toulouse and to himself march northward in search of aid. And here unfolds one of the most paradoxical moments in this chapter of history. To whom could Eudes turn in his time of need? Ironically, he considered approaching his most relentless enemy, Charlemagne, who had recently inflicted a crushing defeat on his forces during a recent internecine Frankish conflict. Whether Eudes officially sought assistance from Charlemagne remains uncertain, for the chronicles of the Franks are silent on this matter. Most historians believe that Charlemagne, preoccupied with his war against the Saxons, either outright ignored Yude's appeals or perhaps viewed them with a quiet, even mocking indifference. Some even speculate that Charlemagne observed the plight of Yudes with a secret, malicious satisfaction, seeing his southern neighbor fall into trouble. Faced with isolation, Yudes was left to his own devices, yet he refused to surrender. Over the course of 3 months, he traversed his duchy, rallying all able-bodied men and local fighters he could find. His efforts culminated on June 9, 721, when Toulouse was already on the brink of falling. Against all odds, Yudes suddenly returned with a surprise attack against the Arab camp. His forces struck with swift and fierce determination, catching the Muslim army unprepared and scattered. The onslaught was brutal, and the Muslim troops were routed decisively. The commanding Arab governor, Al-Sam, was mortally wounded during the chaos and soon succumbed to his injuries. The remnants of his army, in disarray, fled in panic toward Narbonne, abandoning their conquest. The victory at Toulouse proved to be nothing short of astonishing. Arab chroniclers later described it as one of the most devastating disasters inflicted upon the Muslims in Gaul. For the Christian world, this event marked the first major victory over what seemed to be an unstoppable invading force. It was a moment of hope and rallying pride. In the Vatican, Pope Gregory II sent a congratulatory message to Yudes, acclaiming him as a defender of Christianity. For a time, the Duke of Aquitaine became a hero across Christendom, celebrated for his bravery and strategic ingenuity. This victory provided Europe with a crucial respite more than 10 years during which the Arab expansion was halted, and the momentum temporarily shifted. However, this triumph also carried significant repercussions. Buoyed by his success, Yudes began to see himself as the chief protector against the Muslim horde, overestimating his military might and influence. He underappreciated both the strength of his southern neighbors and the ambitions emanating from the north. In an effort to better secure his southern borders and create a buffer zone against future invasions, Yudes embarked on a risky diplomatic maneuver. He entered into an alliance with a rebellious Berber chieftain named Usman ibn Nisa, whom the Franks called Muniza. This Muniza was the ruler of a rugged region called the Cerdan in the Transpyrenean Mountains. He had recently led an uprising against the new governor of Al-Andalus and posed a significant threat to Yudes' strategic plans. To solidify their alliance, Yudes married his daughter, who was possibly born out of wedlock, to Muniza, hoping that this union would forge an unstoppable barrier against future Muslim invasions. Yet, this plan turned into a disastrous gamble. The newly appointed governor of Al-Andalus, Abd ar-Rahman ibn Abdullah al-Ghafiqi, was a seasoned and energetic military leader, a veteran of the Battle of Toulouse. His desire for revenge and his military prowess made him a formidable opponent. The alliance with Muniza, rather than safeguarding Yudes' position, ultimately exposed him to greater peril, as the internal dynamics and ambitions of the region threatened to unravel his carefully laid plans. For him, the alliance between Ed, the Frankish duke, and the rebellious Muslim insurgent was not merely a strategic mistake or a political misstep, it was perceived as outright betrayal and a direct provocation. In the year 731, Abd ar-Rahman launched a swift and decisive campaign to crush the uprising led by Muniza. The rebel leader was killed during his attempt to flee, and his Christian wife, who was also Ed's daughter, was sent in grief to the Caliph in Damascus, bringing devastating news. This sequence of events effectively freed Abd ar-Rahman's hands. He could now exact his revenge on the rebellious captain, but more than that, he was also guided by a desire to challenge those who had sided against him. Meanwhile, Duke Ed's careless alliance had unwittingly provided Abd ar-Rahman with the perfect pretext for an even more formidable invasion aimed at Gaul, the heartland of the Frankish kingdom. Over the vast territory of Aquitaine, and thus over the entire Frankish realm, the threat of an unprecedented military storm was gathering. It seemed as though all of Al-Andalus's formidable military potential had been set in motion, as a colossal force prepared to sweep across the land. By the summer of 732, Abd ar-Rahman al-Ghafiqi had amassed a massive army. The exact number of troops remains a subject of heated debate among historians, both medieval and modern. Legendary chroniclers of various origins, Christian and Muslim alike, tend to exaggerate, often claiming figures in the hundreds of thousands. Modern scholars, analyzing these sources critically, tend to estimate the core of this force more conservatively, though still impressively ranging from 25,000 to 50,000 soldiers. Yet, it was not just the impressive size that made this army formidable, it was also its quality, its hardened fighting spirit. The force comprised a battle-hardened multi-ethnic army trained for prolonged warfare. The central component was the Arab heavy cavalry, drawn from Syria and Yemen, known for their resilience and combat prowess. The most numerous cavalry units were Berbers from North Africa, fierce and tireless warriors renowned for their relentless fighting methods. Alongside the horsemen, there was also infantry recruited from newly converted Muslims in Spain, composed of motivated and loyal fighters eager to prove themselves in battle. Abd ar-Rahman's twin objectives extended beyond simple retribution against Ed. He aimed for two significant conquests. The first was a sizable, targeted raid into the Frankish territories, a raid designed to plunder the vast wealth stored within the region's numerous monasteries and churches, which were famed for their riches and treasures. The second, more ambitious goal was to obliterate the Duchy of Aquitaine itself, possibly to establish a new foothold from which further advances could be launched deeper into the heartlands of Europe. The ultimate target of this military campaign, evidently, was the Basilica of Saint Martin in the city of Tours, one of the most revered and richest sanctuaries in the Western Christian world. Crossing the Ronval Gorge in the Western Pyrenees, Abd ar-Rahman's army descended upon Aquitaine like a destructive wildfire. The first obstacle they faced was the city of Bordeaux, situated on the Garonne River. Duke Ed, rallying all his forces, tried to halt the advancing Muslims at this point, hoping to replicate his earlier triumphs in Toulouse. But this time, the situation was entirely different. Abd ar-Rahman was not an inexperienced commander like Al-Sam, he was a seasoned, cautious general, and his army was far more powerful and organized. A decisive battle unfolded along the banks of the Garonne, which resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Aquitanians. The campaign was marked by utter devastation. Moorish cavalry broke through their lines, charging and slaughtering in a frenzy of brutality. The Chronicle of Masarab from the year 754, one of the closest contemporary sources, records that only God knew the exact number of dead. In the aftermath, Duke Ed and his remaining forces fled, battered and broken, leaving his duchy utterly defenseless. The victorious Arab army then seized Bordeaux and plundered its treasures. Moving swiftly, Abd ar-Rahman's forces advanced upstream along the Garonne, then turned northward toward the closes, burning towns, monasteries, and villas, destroying everything in their path. Men were slaughtered, while women and children were taken into captivity, carried away into slavery, their fates sealed amidst the chaos of war. The path northward had been effectively opened, leaving the entire region exposed to the destructive forces of this formidable invasion. What had begun as a mere invasion soon spiraled into a merciless campaign aimed at eradicating everything in its path, an unrelenting crusade to wipe out the very existence of the conquered land. The Duke Ed, already humiliated and battered, found himself facing a reality he had long avoided. In a moment of despair driven by the threat of complete annihilation, he mounted his horse and galloped northward toward his old enemy, Charles, seeking aid. This act of desperation was the last resort of a man who had lost all control, knowing well that by appealing to the major of the realm he was essentially acknowledging his subordinate status and surrendering any hopes of maintaining independent rulership over his own domain. Yet, the alternative was far worse, the total destruction not only of his country but of his people and all they held dear. At that very time, somewhere far to the north, Charles received reports detailing the extent of the Arab invasion. He understood clearly that after what was happening in Covetania, it would soon be his turn to face the onslaught. But he chose patience over haste, acting with the calculated calmness of a military genius. Instead of rushing into battle, he allowed the Arab forces to advance deeper into Gallic territory, intentionally stretching their supply lines, complicating their communications, and most significantly, overloading themselves with a massive wagon train filled with plunder. This strategic burden slowed their progress considerably and made them more vulnerable, giving Charles a crucial advantage. While Abdurrahman moved closer towards Tours, Charles began mobilizing his own army. He sent messengers throughout Austria and Neustria, calling upon every vassal, every free Frank, to rally beneath his banners. His force grew increasingly diverse, incorporating troops from defeated Germanic tribes such as the Alemanni, Bavarians, possibly even Frisians and Saxons, forming not just a Frankish army but an army representing the entire northern region. Moving southward in secrecy, he deliberately avoided well-known Roman roads, aiming to catch the enemy off guard with a surprise attack. Meanwhile, Abd ar-Rahman reached the vicinity of the Loire and approached Tours. His forces sacked the surrounding countryside, but the city itself remained unconquered, at least, for the time being. It was during this tense moment that intelligence arrived reporting the march of a vast Frankish army from the north, heading straight for his position. Abd ar-Rahman faced a stark choice: retreat southward with his already accumulated loot or stand firm and fight. Confident in the superiority of his cavalry and buoyed by recent quick victories, he chose to confront the enemy head-on. He turned his army around and advanced to meet Charles's forces. The two armies eventually faced each other on an ancient Roman road that linked Poitiers and Tours. The exact location of the forthcoming battle remains uncertain to this day. Historians suggest a few possible sites, yet no definitive identification has been made. What is certain, however, is that these two military giants of their era prepared for confrontation. For a week, cold and tense anticipation hung in the air, with the fate of Europe hanging by a fragile thread. Every soldier understood that the decisive moment was imminent. For 7 long days, the two forces remained entrenched, separated only by a small river or a natural depression. During that time, they observed each other with wary eyes, akin to predators stalking their prey before the final deadly clash. For the Arab army, mainly composed of lightly armed cavalry accustomed to hot, dry climates, the cold, rainy Gallic autumn was an ordeal, a harsh test of endurance. Conversely, the northern European troops thrived in such conditions, their familiarity with the chill giving them a subtle advantage. Charles deliberately delayed the outbreak of combat, intent on exhausting the enemy and acclimating his own soldiers to the sight of their formidable adversaries. His choice of the battlefield was a masterstroke of tactical foresight. He positioned his army on a wooded elevation, a strategic height that provided several key benefits. First, it forced the Arab forces to attack uphill, impeding their cavalry's momentum and diminishing their advantage in speed and maneuverability. This terrain advantage was something Charles had carefully calculated, seeking to break the momentum of the mounted Arab assault while fortifying his own defensive posture. In this way, the stage was set for a confrontation that would go down in history as one of the most significant military encounters of the period, with Europe's future hanging in a delicate balance as two mighty armies prepared to clash. On the other hand, the dense presence of trees and thick shrubs obstructed the movement of the cavalry, preventing it from executing a full, sweeping maneuver or launching a devastating charge aimed at breaking through the enemy lines with a powerful ram. These natural obstacles limited the ability of the mounted troops to perform their roles effectively, forcing them into more constrained and less impactful actions during the battle. Furthermore, the Frankish army was concealed from the view of the opposing forces, hidden behind a screen of foliage and terrain, which made it impossible for the Arabs to accurately assess the true scale and composition of Karl's forces. This concealment granted the Franks a strategic advantage, enabling them to prepare and position themselves without the opponent's knowledge, creating an element of surprise and uncertainty for the attacking Arab army. Now, let's look at the strength and composition of each side's forces. Despite suffering losses in earlier conflicts, Abd al-Rahman's army remained a formidable and substantial force, likely numbering somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 warriors. Its primary striking power lay in its cavalry, which was considered among the best mounted units of that era. Arab horsemen, clad in chainmail and helmets, armed with spears and sabers, set the standard for elite fighters of the time. Their light Berber cavalry, equipped with javelins and short swords, was perfectly suited for initiating combat, harassing the enemy, and conducting pursuit after the main clash. The army of Charles was different both in size and structure. Its numbers probably matched or slightly fell short of that of the Arabs. Estimations range from around 15,000 to 25,000 soldiers. However, the core of the Frankish forces differed significantly from their opponents. Contrary to the widespread myth that their army consisted solely of knights, the crucible of Charles's fighting force was composed mainly of heavily armored infantry. These were seasoned professional warriors, veterans of numerous campaigns, protected by robust armor, such as leather coats reinforced with metal plates, chainmail shirts, round or kite-shaped shields, and conical helmets. Their most important weapons were long spears, short swords known in Frankish tradition as scramasaxes, and the renowned Frankish throwing axes called franciscas. Charles arranged his infantry into a massive, deep phalanx, which an anonymous Arab chronicler later described as a wall of ice. This formation was rigid and immovable, an unbreakable mass of steel and courage designed to absorb and withstand the relentless assaults of the Arab cavalry. While the Franks also fielded cavalry units, they were limited in number and played a secondary role, primarily providing support and reinforcement rather than spearheading the attack. Finally, on one of the last days of October, in the year 732, Abd al-Rahman, exhausted by the stagnation and bitter cold that had permeated the battlefield, issued an urgent and decisive order to attack. The combat erupted with a fierce charge by the Berber light cavalry. These swift horsemen approached the Frankish formation rapidly, hurling javelins and attempting to lure the infantry out of their solid, unified array. However, the Frankish soldiers, well drilled under Charles's strict discipline, stood their ground unwaveringly. They received the hits on their shields, accepting the damage from falling javelins and early losses but showing steadfast resilience. When their light Arab opponents, failing to break through or dislodge the formation, gradually withdrew, Abd al-Rahman decided to commit his main force, the heavy Arab cavalry, against the Franks. This main assault was a relentless tide of steel, a veritable avalanche designed to crush anything in its path. Waves of Arab-mounted warriors repeatedly crashed into the steadfast wall of Frankish shields, attempting to shatter the defenses. The Arab chronicler from 81 years later, an eyewitness from Spain, vividly describes this moment. The northern people stood motionless, like a wall of ice. They pressed together as if frozen in the cold northern winds. With swift, deadly strikes, they cut down the Arabs with their swords. The people of Austrasia, numerous in their martial strength and deadly in their weapons, managed to kill the Arab king Abd al-Rahman himself amid the chaos. The battle raged on throughout the entire day, a grueling conflict of endurance and skill. The Frankish phalanx remained unbroken, resembling a great hedgehog bristling with spears, steadfast amidst the constant barrage of Arab attacks. Though the Arabs suffered heavy casualties and their assault was fiercely resisted, they could not breach the formidable Frankish line. Charles himself fought at the very center of the fray, inspiring his troops with his personal bravery, setting an example that bolstered the morale of his warriors and kept their formation intact despite the fierce onslaught. By evening, when the strength of the attacking forces was waning considerably, a decisive turning point in the battle unfolded. Duke Ed, commanding either one of the flanks or perhaps a specialized unit sent by Charles, executed a clever flank maneuver and launched an attack on the Arabic camp, which was filled with a vast accumulation of looted treasures. This news of an assault on their supply depot spread instantly throughout the ranks of the Arab army. For many fighters, safeguarding their plunder, loot they had traveled so far and fought so fiercely to acquire, became more vital than the battle itself. As a result, some cavalry units, disobeying orders, turned around in a frantic effort to rescue their gathered wealth. Seeing this, others interpreted these movements as a general retreat, causing confusion and disorder to erupt among the attacking soldiers. The formation of their forces was disrupted, and chaos overtook the battlefield. Abd al-Rahman, realizing that his army was breaking apart and losing control, desperately attempted to restore order amid the turmoil. He threw himself into the thick of the desperate retreating lines, calling on his troops to turn back and re-engage in combat. Yet, amidst his efforts, he was surrounded by Frankish foot soldiers and caught in a deadly confrontation, which resulted in his death. The loss of their commander and the ensuing panic dealt a decisive blow to the Arab forces, sealing their defeat. With night falling, the remnants of the Arabic army retreated swiftly back to their fortified camp, leaving the battlefield behind. The following morning, the Frankish forces, having regrouped and prepared for further combat, waited to see if their enemies would return for another clash. However, no sounds of activity emanated from the Arab camp. Suspecting a trap, King Charles sent out scouts to investigate. These reconnaissance missions returned with startling news: the camp was completely deserted. Under cover of darkness, and having been demoralized by the death of their leader coupled with disagreements between Arab and Berber chieftains, the Muslims abandoned everything tents, wounded, and the bulk of their plunder and fled southward with remarkable haste. King Charles, cautious about a possible ambush, forbade his soldiers from pursuing the retreating enemy. This was an astute decision. Primarily, he feared an enemy trap set for pursuit troops eager to overtake and ambush them. Secondly, his army, composed mainly of militia fighters after their recent victory and the spoils collected, might have simply dispersed to go home, ending the campaign prematurely. Their primary mission had been accomplished, the enemy army was routed, and their leader slain. The threat that had hung over the Frankish realm was effectively eliminated. The battlefield, lying between Tours and Poitiers, was left stained not only with the remnants of Abd ar-Rahman's army but also with the shattered hope of the Umayyad Caliphate's ambition to conquer Gaul. It was after this momentous victory that Charles acquired the legendary epithet Martel, meaning hammer, a moniker symbolizing how he shattered the Arab tide like a mighty hammer beating down an invading wave. The victory at Poitiers rapidly and profoundly shifted the power dynamics within Gaul. For Charles, this triumph became the pinnacle of his career, the crowning achievement of his authority and influence. His growing prestige within the Frankish realm, which had already been substantial, now became undeniable and unassailable. No longer merely the leader of one faction among the Frankish tribes, Charles Martel was now widely regarded as the savior of the entire Christian populace in the region. This recognition provided him not only with moral authority but also with significant political leverage to pursue his ultimate goal, unifying the Frankish kingdom under his sole leadership. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Charles did not rest on his laurels. Over the following years, he launched multiple campaigns further south, steadily consolidating his power. He compelled the heirs of Ed to swear fidelities of vassalage, thereby strengthening his influence over the surrounding territories. Subsequently, Charles expanded his military efforts into Septimania and Provence, regions where he reclaimed key cities such as Avignon and Nîmes from Arab control. Although he was unable to seize the main stronghold of Narbonne, he devastated its outskirts, leaving behind scorched earth in an effort to prevent any future invasions from the Muslim forces. In essence, the Battle of Poitiers marked the beginning of the end of Arab expansion into Frankish territory. It was a turning point that halted the Muslim advance into what would become modern France and signaled the waning of their dominance in the region. The defeat at Poitiers was a significant blow for the Muslim world, yet it did not prove to be a catastrophic turning point on the grand scale of the entire caliphate's expansion. The loss of a large army and a talented commander represented a serious setback, halting their advances beyond the Pyrenees and preventing further northward progression. However, the primary reason for the cessation of their northern campaigns was rooted not just in military defeat, but in the internal troubles besetting Al-Andalus itself. In the 740s, North Africa and Spain were shaken by a major Berber uprising that ignited widespread chaos and civil conflict within the province for several decades, severely weakening the region's stability. Meanwhile, in the year 750, in Damascus, a political upheaval occurred. A coup ousted the Umayyad dynasty, leading to the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate. The new Abbasid rulers shifted their focus away from European conquests and turned their attention eastward, towards the burgeoning center of the empire, Baghdad. As a result, Europe no longer occupied a prime position in the priorities of the Islamic world, and the jihads directed at the west diminished significantly. But what tone does the Battle of Poitiers hold in the broader context of world history? Has Charles Martel truly saved Europe from conquest? This question has sparked intense debate among historians over the centuries. For centuries, the dominant traditional view, rooted in the writings of the esteemed English historian Edward Gibbon from the 15th century, claims that the Battle of Poitiers marked one of the pivotal moments in history. Gibbon argued that if not for Charles Martel's victory, the Arab fleet might have entered the Thames estuary, and the city of Oxford could now be teaching the Quran. According to this perspective, Poitiers was a turning point that halted the Islamic expansion into Europe, thereby preserving Europe's Christian identity. This interpretation gained substantial popularity during the 9th and 20th centuries, when the battle was viewed as a symbol of the eternal confrontation between the Christian West and the Muslim East. However, in recent decades, a wave of revisionist scholarship has challenged this long-held narrative. A new school of thought suggests that the importance of this battle has been significantly overstated. Their arguments are nuanced and multifaceted. First, they emphasize that the event was essentially a raid, not an outright conquest or invasion, and therefore little more than a raid rather than a full-scale military campaign aimed at colonization. The revisionists contend that Abdul-Rahman's expedition was primarily about plunder and aggressive raid aimed at wealth accumulation rather than an attempt to colonize or incorporate Gallia into the caliphate. They point out that the Arabs lacked the demographic strength and logistical capacity to control such vast and densely populated territories beyond the battleground. Second, some argue that other battles were more decisive in shaping European history. For instance, the Battle of Toulouse in the year 721 is viewed by some historians as even more significant. The victory there by Eudes, Duke of Aquitaine, halted the first serious attempt at further conquest and provided Europe with a crucial 10-year breathing space. This interlude allowed Charles Martel to consolidate and strengthen his power, laying the foundations for future resistance. Third, internal issues within the caliphate, such as the Berber rebellion and the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, are seen by many scholars as the critical factors bringing the Islamic expansion into the West to a halt, rather than a mere military defeat at Poitiers. The rising internal strife and internal political upheavals significantly distracted the caliphate, causing it to lose interest in European lands altogether. Fourth, interestingly enough, Arab sources virtually omit mention of the Battle of Poitiers. While European chroniclers considered the event a monumental milestone in their history, Arab records mention it only in passing, referring to it as the Battle on the Road of the Martyrs, a phrase meaning the Road of the Slain. They framed it as one of many setbacks suffered on the distant frontiers of a sprawling empire, rather than a decisive turning point. So where does the truth truly lie? Perhaps, as is often the case with pivotal historical events, the answer is somewhere in the middle. It was undoubtedly a significant event in shaping the course of European history, but it was not solely responsible for halting Islamic expansion nor defining the entire fate of the continent. The importance of the Battle of Poitiers should be viewed as part of a complex web of military, political, and internal developments that collectively influenced the course of history for centuries to come. It is impossible to deny that the Battle of Poitiers carried profound psychological and political significance for Europe as a whole. This decisive confrontation halted the most expansive and devastating Arab invasion into Gaul, effectively stopping the rapid advancement of the Muslim armies into Western Europe. It resulted in the death of one of the most skilled and revered Muslim military commanders, dealing not just a tactical blow but also a significant moral setback to the invading forces. Moreover, the victory solidified the authority of the Carolingian dynasty, laying the groundwork for the creation of the Carolingian Empire, which would become the cradle of medieval Europe. Had Charles Martel faced defeat, the course of history would undeniably have taken a markedly different direction. Perhaps Gaul would never have become a province of the Caliphate, but it is plausible that the region would have been ravaged and its political independence undermined, potentially leading to a vastly different geopolitical landscape in Western Europe. Thus, the Battle of Poitiers transcends its immediate military context and assumes a role as a potent symbol and emblem of resistance and a pivotal clash between civilizations. While it was not the single decisive factor, it acted as a catalyst, a small but critical drop that overflowed the cup, marking the end of Arab ambitions for westward expansion across the continent. It was the moment when a wave, rolling forth from Arabia over 7,000 kilometers away, was shattered by another wave rising from the dense forests of Germania. At this boundary, this watershed line, a new Europe was born, one forged at the intersection of two great civilizations and cultures. Now, let us return to that cold, fog-shrouded field from which our story began. Once the morning mist lifted after the fierce clash, the victorious observers saw not merely a heap of corpses and abandoned weapons. Instead, what lay before them was the dawn of a transformed world, a world in which they held dominion. The echoes of the blows struck at Poitiers resonated across the continent, influencing its course of development for generations to come. The legacy of Charles Martel was colossal. He was no king in title, yet he embodied a force far greater than monarchy. He was the founder of a new dynasty, whose influence would shape history. His son, Pippin the Short, no longer content with shadowy power, sought to cement his authority openly. With the blessing of the Pope, who saw in the Franks a shield against the Lombards, he deposed the last Merovingian king shorn of his royal robes and sent into monastic exile. This act marked the rise of the Carolingian dynasty, and Charles the Great, grandson of Charles Martel, would later forge an empire encompassing nearly all of Western Europe. In the year 800, he was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome, reviving the idea of a unified Christian empire in the West. All of this would have been impossible without the military and political foundations laid by his grandfather, secured at Poitiers, a vital pillar of the emerging Carolingian power and, ultimately, of medieval Europe itself. Meanwhile, on the distant shores of the Iberian Peninsula, in Al-Andalus, the defeat at Poitiers and its aftermath unexpectedly triggered a different course of events. In the year 756, Abd ar-Rahman, one of the few surviving princes of the deposed Umayyad dynasty, arrived in the region. Seizing power, he established an independent emirate of Córdoba, which would eventually develop into a mighty caliphate. Cut off from the rest of the Islamic world, Al-Andalus followed a path unique among Muslim territories, shifting away from military conquest of Europe to become a luminous center of culture, learning, and art. While Europe entered its dark ages, cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada flourished with advancements in philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. Magnificent mosques and palaces were constructed, reflecting a vibrant civilization that thrived amid political independence and cultural brilliance. The region, having broken free from the threat of conquest, embarked on a trajectory defined more by intellectual and artistic flourishing than military expansion, leaving a distinctive mark on the history of the medieval world. It may come as a paradox, but the defeat at Poitiers, which halted the expansion of the Arab armies into Western Europe, perhaps inadvertently fostered a cultural renaissance within Islamic Spain. This pivotal battle did not carve an insurmountable barrier separating two worlds, rather, it marked a boundary across which two great civilizations, Christian and Islamic, continued to interact, clash, trade, and exchange ideas. Far from being merely a line of division, this frontier gradually transformed into a zone of both conflict and synthesis, fertile ground where cultural influences intertwined and enriched each other over time. Despite its tangible outcomes, the significance of the Battle of Poitiers extends beyond the battlefield, embodying a symbol of resilience and collective memory, especially within Western traditions. To the peoples of Europe, this event remains a moment etched deeply into their historical consciousness, a time when a fractured and ostensibly weakened continent found the strength to stand against what seemed an invincible force. While this narrative borders on myth, it has played a crucial role in shaping Europe's self-perception, fostering a sense of unity rooted in the idea of a Christian West capable of resisting domination. In this story, Charles Martel emerges as a central figure, an often rough and ruthless military leader, known for raiding churches to build his army, yet also revered as a hammer of God, a savior of faith, and a decisive strategist who carved his name into history. History, however, avoids contemplating the realm of the hypothetical. We shall never truly know what might have transpired if the seemingly unbreakable Frankish shield had shattered on that cold October day. Nevertheless, the events unfolded as they did. One empire reached its limits, while another, rising from the ruins of the old world and blood spilled at Poitiers, began its ascent toward greatness. Within this violent confrontation, amid the brutal birth of a new order, Europe's true foundation was laid, an amalgamation of resilience, conflict, and cultural exchange that ultimately shaped the continent we inherit today. The scars of that clash, the bloodshed and upheaval, contributed to forging Europe's identity, a complex tapestry woven from conquest and cooperation alike. It is from this crucible that our ancestors emerged, and from which our modern Europe, with all its diversity and endurance, has evolved.